welcome the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Stick with the plan. The plan is working. You can see that on the economy. You can see it in lower taxes.
Where do you even start with this bollocks?
You can see that on the economy.
Well, imagine the shock for GB News viewers when they find out the OBR has slammed the government's spending plans beyond 2025 as worse than fiction. And if you want to know just how insane the Tories' management of the UK economy has been, just listen to this from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
Are you saying that come what may, even if employers begin to struggle and your promise of growth gets torpedoed because nobody can find anybody to do the work, that you're going to bring down the numbers come what may?
I'm not just saying this, Trevor. I'm telling you that we have a plan to make sure that this is the case.
Heaven help us. Is it any wonder the UK is the only G7 economy where real household disposable income per head hasn't recovered to its pre-pandemic levels?
You can see it in lower taxes.
Well, imagine the shock for the Prime Minister when he finds out that under his government, taxes are on course to reach their highest level since the Second World War. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has found that for every £1 the Treasury has taken from taxpayers, less than 25 pence is coming back in tax cuts. And the Prime Minister actually wants us to throw a party. By any standard, Sunak's government is being fundamentally dishonest and outright misleading when talking about tax cuts. In fact, the government's latest measures put the UK on course to have the biggest tax-raising parliament in modern history.
Because we've got a plan and we stuck to it, inflation is down from 11 to 4%.
Hang on. When inflation started to accelerate in early 2022, Rishi Sunak, as Chancellor, attributed the rise to global factors. Now as Prime Minister, he's claiming it as a success for government policy that it's come down. Never underestimate just how thick this lot think we all are. And just to be clear on this, the job of cutting inflation is for the Bank of England. So any suggestion the government is responsible for it falling just insults the public's intelligence. And let's not forget it was this government that helped give us the highest inflation in 40 years in the first place, in part due to its incompetent management of the economy. And remember this, contrary to what Sunak keeps telling us, falling inflation is not a tax cut for hard-up families. Falling inflation just means prices are rising more slowly than they were before. It doesn't mean that price levels are actually falling. So it won't immediately help the families now struggling to put food on the table.
Debt is on track to fall.
This isn't even funny anymore. Sunak's government has given us the highest debt in 60 years. On the measure of debt that the government itself uses for its own targets, it's completely untrue to say that debt is falling.
Wages have now been rising steadily for the last 6 months.
Real wages in 2024 are forecast to be lower than they were in 2006. Just think about that.
And although of course there are challenges in the NHS, we've eliminated the longest waits, people waiting 2 years or a year and a half, and that is progress.
The NHS waiting list has hit a record high of 7.7 million, and the number of patients on waiting lists is predicted to hit 8 million by the summer. That's quite an achievement. And let's add to that crumbling NHS hospitals in danger of collapse and thousands dying every year waiting for treatment. And if all that's not bad enough, just listen to this.
Let's look at 12-hour waits on a trolley for a hospital bed, practically unheard of in the early 2010s. There were some months when literally no one in England's NHS waited that long, but in 2023 it was happening to 35,000 people a month on average. That's over 3,000 times worse than in 2011.
The NHS is doing more than it's ever done before. We haven't made enough of a dent in the waiting list. Now we've practically eliminated the number of people waiting the longest, 2 years, 1.5 years. But overall the waiting list has largely risen over the past year. The good news is though, we saw that it started to fall because we didn't have strikes for a period at the end of last year. And that has been a real challenge, and I'll just be honest with you about that.
Well, firstly, Sunak himself has been accused of personally holding up a deal to end the doctors' strikes in England. So if he's blaming striking doctors for waiting lists not falling, he's effectively blaming himself. And second, by now even Larry the Cat knows that NHS waiting lists were already soaring under the Conservative government long before any strike action by doctors.
Do we stick with this plan, our plan, that is starting to deliver the change that you all want and the country deserves?
Millions are now living in poverty and destitution, and millions more are skipping meals and cutting back on food. We've got untreated sewage dumped in our rivers, crumbling schools and hospitals, and thousands dying waiting for hospital treatment. Does all that sound like a plan that's working? And it gets worse. Sunak's government is busily shutting down accountability in Parliament, through the courts and on the streets, with an anti-strike law designed to rob millions of workers of their democratic right to strike. An Elections Act which will lock millions of people out of the electoral process. A blatant act of voter suppression by the government. And new laws will strip back our right to protest and limit our rights to judicial review. An affront to the very principles of fairness and government accountability.